Hello, CNT, and welcome to our final deeper dive into Acts. Acts tells the story of the Holy Spirit guiding the early church as they took the good news of Jesus Christ across the Mediterranean world in a generation. Apostolic giants like Peter and Paul led the charge, but they were not alone. Many regular people not so different from you and I, are a part of the mission as well. This is one of the reasons I love this book. God uses normal, less than perfect people to accomplish His will, sometimes in spite of themselves. Have you noticed this as you're reading Acts? Let's take a look at a short section in chapters 15 through 16 and discover some regular folks doing extraordinary things as they follow the Spirit of the risen Lord. Towards the end of chapter 15, we read that Paul and Barnabas desire to go back to the cities that they had evangelized during Paul's first missionary journey, the one recorded earlier in chapters 13 and 14. However, this second missionary journey gets off to a rocky start. Indeed, Paul and Barnabas get into a fight. Acts 15:36. And after some days, Paul said to Barnabas, "Let us return and visit the brothers in every city where we proclaim the word of the Lord and see how they are." Now Barnabas wanted to take with them John called Mark, but Paul thought it best not to take with them one who had withdrawn from them in Pamphylia and had not gone with them to the work. And there arose a sharp disagreement, so that they separated from each other. Barnabas took Mark with him and sailed away to Cyprus. But Paul chose Silas and departed, having been commended by the brothers to the grace of the Lord. And he went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. In verse 37, we see these two brothers, Barnabas and Mark. Barnabas is actually a nickname for a man named Joseph. That's a good thing, too. We don't need another Joseph in the New Testament to keep track of. In chapter 4 of Acts, we see this Barnabas come upon the scene. Thus, Joseph, who was also called by the apostles Barnabas, which means son of encouragement, a Levite, a native of Cyprus, sold a field that belonged to him and brought the money and laid it at the apostles' feet. His character is discovered in the name, for Barnabas is an encourager. He befriends Paul when the early church was suspicious of the man. He traveled with Paul on the first missionary journey and was about to go on the second when they disagreed about Mark. Mark, a young man, was Barnabas's cousin. He had left the first missionary journey, and Paul no longer trusted him. But Barnabas, ever the encourager, was willing to give Mark another chance. I have seen members of the church fight over this very issue. Some desire to extend forgiveness and a second chance. Others are about the success of the project because it is a very serious work. And note that neither man prayed or sought intermediaries in this affair. Neither man looks good. However, the Lord was not stymied by their dispute, as we shall see. Were Paul and Barnabas destined to be enemies forever? No. Whereas there is no record of the men working closely again, Paul mentions Barnabas in Galatians, 1 Corinthians, and Colossians, and always in a positive manner. Their esteem for one another has been restored. There is hope for our injured relationships as well. Speaking of restoration, let's look to Mark. This young man needed a second chance and received it from the Lord through the ministrations of Barnabas. Now, what happened to Mark after this? We know that he ended up in Rome with Peter. This young man matured into the writer of the Gospel of Mark, which he did while he was with Peter in Rome. Now, surprisingly, Paul came to see Mark as a faithful worker for the gospel as well. Now, are you a young person who has made mistakes that have cost you the trust of others? Mark has been there before you, and God gave Mark a second act. He can do the same with you as well. Moving on into chapter 16 of Acts, we find Paul, sans Barnabas and Mark, back at Lystra, which he had evangelized in chapter 14. It is here that Paul finds young Timothy. This young man was willing to pay the price to follow Paul. We learn from 2 Timothy that this young man's mother was Jewish, and that she and Timothy's grandmother probably came to faith during Paul and Barnabas' earlier visit to Lystra. Timothy's father was not Jewish but Greek, and so Timothy was not circumcised. Even though circumcision was not a requirement for salvation, Paul had Timothy circumcised so that he could follow him into the synagogues and share Christ as they traveled. When we follow Jesus, we begin the process of turning every aspect of our lives over to him. What have you given up to follow Jesus? Timothy will follow Jesus throughout his life, and as a young pastor, he was the recipient of 2 New Testament books, 1st and 2nd Timothy. After receiving Timothy, Paul desires to push further up into Asia, but he is prevented from doing this. Acts 16, verse 6. And they went through the region of Phrygia and Galatia, having been forbidden by the Holy Spirit to speak the word in Asia. And when they had come up to Mysia, they attempted to go into Bithynia, but the Spirit of Jesus did not allow them. So, passing by Mysia, they went down to Troas. And a vision appeared to Paul in the night. A man of Macedonia was standing there, urging him and saying, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." And when Paul had seen the vision, immediately we sought to go on into Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to preach the gospel to them. Paul is stopped, at least in part, because God desires to use 2 more saints we will look at. You will note in this passage, known as the Macedonian call, the pronouns change. They becomes we. Luke, the man the Lord would use to write the Gospel of Luke in the book of Acts, joins the band. Sometimes we are prevented from what we desire to do, yet in retrospect we realize the Lord has something better for us, even though it was not what we wanted at the time. What Paul wanted was to go into Asia. What he needed was Luke. Following this call, they traveled to the region of Macedonia and the city of Philippi. Acts 16:11. So setting sail from Troas, we made a direct voyage to Samothrace, and the following day to Neapolis, and from there to Philippi, which is a leading city of the district of Macedonia and a Roman colony. We remained in this city some days, and on the Sabbath day, we went outside the gate to the riverside, where we supposed there was a place of prayer, and we sat down and spoke to the women who had come together. One who heard us was a woman named Lydia, from the city of Thyatira, a seller of purple goods, who was a worshiper of God. The Lord opened her heart to pay attention to what was said by Paul, and after she was baptized, and her household as well, she urged us, saying, "If you have judged me to be faithful to the Lord, come to my house and stay." And she prevailed upon us. When they arrive in Philippi, somehow they hear of a prayer meeting happening down by the river. It is being led by a God-fearer named Lydia. God-fearers, or worshippers of God, were Gentiles who worshiped the one true God, but had not undergone the rites to become Jewish. Lydia is one of these. We are told that she is a businesswoman who imported purple garments from her probable hometown of Thyatira. She becomes a believer, and the first church of Philippi begins meeting in her house. Now let me quote from Bible scholar D. Edmund Hibbert in describing Lydia. Lydia may aptly be characterized as a businesswoman with an open heart and an open house. Yes, the apostles were men, and yes, God has chosen men to serve him as elders and pastors. However, this does not mean that God does not use women. A close look at the New Testament and effective leaders like Lydia plainly states that the Lord uses women in a powerful way. He always has, and he always will. Now, in this section of Acts, we are seeing God using regular people to spread his gospel. They weren't perfect, just like us, but they were willing. Are we willing? God has always used people like us to impact the world, one soul at a time.